Hey, everybody. Stephen Gunlock here. I'm the pastor of congregational and group life here at City Church San Francisco. And I'm excited tonight to host our second summer Meet Someone Interesting series, in which we will get to know a member of the City Church community around particular wisdom or experience that they have to share with us. And the hope here is that in addition to some interesting conversation, that you'll get to know and interact with someone who you might not know in real life, but hopefully you will be able to know, at least to some extent, in real life when we come back together in person. But tonight I'm really excited because we have Sarah Behr with us, who is a financial planner, fiduciary, and founder of her independent practice, Simplify Financial. And the plan for the time that we're on here is to start with me essentially interviewing Sarah, followed by Q&A from you all. So you can start asking your questions now in the chat boxes, either on Facebook or on YouTube. And the way that'll work once we get to the Q&A is we have, in addition to Sarah, we have Jason Morrell on here. Hi, Jason. Jason is the Roz to my Frasier. He's our producer extraordinaire, and he'll be fielding those questions and trying to hit on as many as possible. If for some reason, if we get a lot of questions and we by chance don't get to yours, please bear with us, and we'll try to ask the ones that encapsulate as much of the sentiment being shared in the chat as possible. But there's a good chance in all likelihood that we will be able to get to your specific questions, and we'll leave time for that. So with that sort of introductory plan for what to expect, welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi.
So before we get into some of the more meatier questions that we might have around finances right now, I'd love for folks to get to hear just a little bit about you, about where you're from, how long you've been in the city, how you ended up at City Church, and then what drew you into the field of financial planning.
Okay, great. So I grew up born and raised in Virginia, Southern Virginia, in a town called Roanoke, and moved out west after college. I went to school in North Carolina and I moved to the West Coast, hopped around in South for a year. My brother was there. And then I moved to Sun Valley, Idaho, where I found a love for the mountains, skiing, camping. I just really enjoyed being outdoors. And so for about a decade, I lived in Sun Valley. I got married there and had a pizza restaurant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a really fun endeavor. I had always worked in the service industry, and my partner and I, my husband and I at the time, found that there's no better place for a pizza restaurant than a ski town. And so that worked out really well.
Totally. Yeah. I've experienced that craving for pizza after skiing. It's a real thing.
Yeah, like a slice, a beer. So the arc of my 20s was as a restaurant owner and a business owner, and kind of learned everything from the ground up about how to run a business. And many people in my family have been business owners, so I think I had that sort of entrepreneurial slant going into it. When I was around 30, my husband and I divorced. We had a 2-year-old daughter, Iris, who some of y'all have met at church. She's now 12. And following the divorce, I was not involved in the business anymore. It didn't make sense for us to continue to run the business. And so I started working in finance because I sort of carried my business experience and my financial experience into a formal career in financial services. And that mostly was like wealth management, as you think of it, like a stockbroker at Morgan Stanley or UBS, that sort of thing. And that's what brought me to San Francisco. I was looking for professional opportunity. While Sun Valley was a really beautiful place to live, there were some limits professionally and socially that I found after 10 years there. It was kind of time for me to move on. And that brought me to San Francisco. And also a lot of personal and spiritual reasons. And here I worked for UBS and Credit Suisse. And after a few years, I sort of came to this realization that what I was doing was not, as a financial planner was not accessible to my peers. I was working a lot with ultra high net worth individuals. And I felt like it didn't align with my values because there's a lot of conflict of interest in that trade, as some people might know from reading in the media. So I decided to start my own practice, and what has evolved has been really rewarding. So I, first and foremost, am a fiduciary, which means I have no affiliation with any financial institution. I have no horse in the race. I want folks to be holistically secure about their finances. But I am not in the business of selling anything, whether it's stocks or CDs or insurance policies, any of that. So I make recommendations on that. It also is very transparent. My clients pay me a flat fee. There's no sort of ongoing gradual fees that I charge. And then it's gotten me back to my roots as sort of an entrepreneur and a business owner, which is what I really enjoy. I can shape the company and kind of think about what types of services I find most rewarding, what types of services most of my clients need. So I've really enjoyed it. How I got to City Church is I found City Church on the internet and desperately needed a church community as I was restarting my life in San Francisco as a single mother, and have been part of the church for over 5 years. I'm really involved at City Hope as well. I serve on the advisory board at City Hope. And so I've been really lucky to have found this community.
Yeah, well, we're lucky that you found us as well, and it's wonderful to hear
Thank you.
a little bit about your story, and that word fiduciary, and running a business that's really helping people with their finances sounds really rewarding, and is also, I just think, really, really interesting. But moving a little bit into the topic of finances, going into today, I was thinking a little bit about how I've thought about money the past few months, and realized that so I'm someone who can kind of geek out a little bit on just tracking spending. Like, I find that kind of fun for some reason. And so I've usually been pretty good about that. But then when COVID hit, despite being home more and stuff like that, I didn't track at all in February, March, and April, just because it somehow like brought more anxiety. Like, it was a reminder that I, couldn't control things, couldn't control necessarily how this might impact me, that I didn't know how I would be impacted. And so as far as money go, I sort of had to bury my head in the sand mentality for a few months because of the additional anxiety that it created. And I really just made sure the bills were paid, and was pretty sure that I was spending more money on ice cream and wine than before. And otherwise was just like, I think everything's fine, but I just don't want to think about that. But I think what I've experienced a lot of is just sort of like anxiety, and I don't want to think about it or even know what's going on, because that's going to just make me feel more anxious when there's so much that feels out of control in the world. But I'm wondering, like, for you in your work, what are you hearing from clients over and over again? Or what are you finding yourself having to tell clients over and over again as they come to you with, I'm sure, maybe a lot of different questions than they maybe were back in January?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple categories. Folks that have retirement accounts and money that is specifically designated, whether it's through your employer-sponsored account, like a 401k or an IRA. That money, assuming folks are, say, under the age of 55 and they still are working, I would say ride it out, leave it, don't make any emotional changes. The plan is that you don't need that money for 10 or 15 years. So just sit with it and continue to contribute as you're able to. But for money that we feel like is for more near-term goals, whether it was I was saving money for a down payment, or I'm going to take a year off next year and travel, that should be very secure. So whether secure is all cash or it's in some sort of CD where it's earning a little bit of interest. But kind of the first priority is to make sure that you have enough money available to get you through 3 to 6 months of emergencies. So if you were to lose your job, you need about 90 days. I would love it if folks had 6 months worth of expenses to cover. I think that's really challenging in a place like San Francisco. So I don't say that that's like expected. But that will help you sleep better at night, knowing like if the sky is falling, I can still pay my mortgage or my rent. I can make my car payment. I can put food on the table. And yeah, maybe I cancel my gym membership, which because of COVID, most of our gym memberships have been canceled anyway.
Got canceled automatically.
But the bare kind of like what I need to be comfortable. And also not just eating beans and rice, but have wine and ice cream so that you're not panicking or in an anxious state. If some people really needed to feel like they could cut back on their spending if they needed to. And so you have to start with a baseline of how much are you really spending? And the only way to do that is to geek out on a spreadsheet like you do, or use one of these. Some banks have a tool where they categorize your credit card spending for you. So it's kind of automated, but you have to be really honest and know, okay, over the course of 6 months or a year, how much do I spend every month to be comfortable? And then there's some months that we go big. We buy a lot of gifts, or we're going out to eat a lot, or we're traveling a lot. And we know that those things, we can like cut back on those variable expenses. But kind of the same way we are about finance is how we should be about like diet and exercise, like strive for the middle path. Like the moderate way is what's most sustainable. And if you look at your grocery bill every month and it's $1,000 because you have, that's comfortable, then don't set a goal to all of a sudden only spend $500 a month on groceries. It's not realistic. And it's kind of like if you go on a starvation diet, eventually you're going to rebound. And so if the goal is to feel like I have more control over my spending, I can decide where I want to indulge and where it's not important to indulge, then that's much more empowering.
That's helpful to hear. I'm definitely hearing the, have a plan, stick with your plan as long as you are able to, and know what's going on, as helps with anxiety. I'm wondering too, we talked a little bit about this when we talked a few days ago, just about, and I think I have a fire truck going by, so you might, sure you can hear that now.
Yeah.
But we talked a little bit about like, as you kind of look at what you're spending and, sometimes just the sheer number in San Francisco can seem extravagant when in the reality here, it's not extravagant or it's normal. Do you have any thoughts about that? Just people who might come from cheaper places or more frugal backgrounds, and then they start to look and they're like, oh, wow, is this okay?
Yeah, but I think so there's a lot of shame in that. Like if you really track how much you're spending on restaurants and takeout over a year or 6 months, most people are completely stunned. And I myself am stunned when I look at my own family budget. Cause I'm like, what? Like we got tacos and like once I went and got coffee, like it wasn't outrageous. Yeah. And how does it get to be this number? Yeah. So that's kind of like lifestyle creep in expensive coastal cities, whether it's San Francisco or, another place. But again, like being honest and not having any shame about it, it's all kind of a function of what percentage of your income you're spending on wants, needs, and savings, and not necessarily what the number is. If it's $20,000 or if it's $2,000, like are you in debt or can you afford that? And if you can afford that and you can still meet your other needs and you're saving what you need to be saving, then so be it. But folks that are afraid to look, you have to get over that fear. And like you have to come up with a system that works for you. And it doesn't need to be like a look at your spending every week, because I think that can drive a lot of people crazy. And especially when you have a couple or a family that have different attitudes about spending. So quarterly is probably a normal time to look and kind of assess where you're at. Grocery spending has gone up a ton in the past couple months, and things like Amazon and Target. And then obviously restaurants have gone down somewhat. Retail spending has gone down. So we've kind of made, you take from one and you're not getting a haircut, but you're buying more ice cream.
Yeah. It's a great combo. Yeah. Thanks for that. That's helpful to hear. Folks, we will get into Q&A in a little bit. So just a reminder that if you haven't already, to post your questions now, either in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll start getting to those in just a couple minutes. But before we move into that, Sarah, I just wanted to acknowledge too that for the people with us right now, there's likely a pretty big variability in the way that people have experienced the financial impact of COVID so far. I'm betting that there are folks on here who are out of work, who might be reliant on pandemic unemployment benefits that have yet to be renewed, hopefully will be renewed by Congress. But there's people on here who might be in a situation where they're really approaching the possibility of needing to ask family or their community or our community for help. And then on the other hand, there's probably a lot of people on here who are doing okay right now, but have a lot of anxiety about the future. So I guess my sort of two-pronged question is like, what advice would you have for someone who is really in the thick of it with this crisis so far, is wondering, am I going to have to ask for help? What do I do? And then on the other end of the spectrum, the person who might be fine and wondering, what does generosity, what does giving look like while there's so much anxiety about the future? Just any thoughts you have around that?
I think folks that are really having a hard time covering all their expenses right now, to look at, be careful about not accruing too much debt. But I think I have a lot of clients who have things like student loans and credit card payments that they were very diligent about paying off, and they had a plan for up until now. And then suddenly they have a lot less income coming in. So they have to make some choices. And so we strategize about like, well, how can you renegotiate the interest rate or consolidate debt? Or is there maybe a possibility that you cut back on retirement savings temporarily so that you can still meet these goals for paying down this credit card? Student loans are kind of, in some cases, have been there's more space to negotiate right now because there's forbearance, but there's still an emotional toll of feeling like you can't cover that. And then also trying to think about, what are my resources outside of credit cards where I can find help if I need it. And there are a lot of resources, and a lot, like, I think I'd be happy to point folks in a direction of different lists of resources. But beyond that, if it's as simply as asking for a personal loan, I think that this is such a global crisis, and that no one can deny. There's this sort of habit in America that, if you are in a tight spot, you must have done something to get there. And if you're in a prosperous place, you must have done something to get there. And we know that that's just simply not true, and especially not in these circumstances. So many people have been affected. But it is quite humbling. And so if you get to the point where you need to ask friends or family for help, or the church, knowing how much you need and what your plan is for that money is important, so that you don't end up in a panic in another 60 days. So again, starting with like, how much do I need to each month to be comfortable? What's realistic? And don't set sort of lofty goals that you might not be able to reach. Like you're not just going to eat hard-boiled eggs for a month. So how are you going to use that money? How much do you need? And then what are some other possibilities if it doesn't work out? So like what's plan A through plan J of like all the things that you can do to kind of take action and improve your situation, and then also be faithful that God will provide, which is challenging as well, but keeping that faith. For folks that have the ability to be more generous, I mean, there's no better time than right now. There's so many needs. And so being really thoughtful about having a plan of how much you want to give away. It might not be all right now. It might be over the course of the year, to space it out, or to wait and see what your job security might be and what your family's needs might be before you, but in any case, to not be too reactive, but to know that you're committed to charitable giving as part of your values.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And I'm hearing, again, it's like this thing of like knowing what's going on, having a plan, maybe even allowing yourself to take a moment to think through some what if scenarios, and then sort of setting that aside. And then I think the biggest thing in terms of need is like recognizing, that this is a global emergency. It's not anyone's fault if they find themselves in difficulty right now. So I think that's really helpful to hear. So I think we should be ready to move into some Q&A. Hand things over to Jason for a second to give us an update on that.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. We have a few questions coming in. Sarah, this is the first question for you. Seems like a pizza joint in a ski town during summer is kind of like a shelter-in-place order during a pandemic. Mm-hmm. What types of overlaps have you seen or not?
Well, so surprisingly, ski towns and mountain towns do really well in the summer and the winter. And then they have these like what we call slack in the spring and the fall when things aren't as busy. So I think if the question is kind of like, how do you build resilience into your plan? You have, what we found and what I would say carries over into my personal life is knowing the goals of like how much you can afford to spend, save, and having the ability to kind of control your discretionary spending at times when things aren't as lush. And that's all about, one, knowing where your money is going every month, and then also having some self-discipline to hold back when you need to. But also like not being so austere that you can't enjoy yourself or reward yourself. I think that I grew up definitely in a home, Protestant work ethic, very austere, very modest. And I really appreciate those values that I was brought up with, but it makes it really hard sometimes for me to indulge myself and spend money like if I've like earned it or it's been like a reward. And that personality type can lead to like sort of hyper anxiety around like, oh, do I have enough? I'm never going to have enough. And we know kind of from our Christian tradition that like there is a hole there that cannot be filled. Like you can only find that comfort through God. And so at some point you have to let go of it. And I don't know if that directly answered the question, but there's sort of this fine balance of having the discipline around spending, but also enough foresight to plan ahead and know that things aren't always going to be on the up and up. There's a hard time coming, and I have within my power, I can control my needs.
I like one interjection there too that you made me think of was the way that this crisis in other ways, but definitely around money too, is bringing up all our trigger points. So if we, whatever trigger points we have from, our upbringing or our life to date around money, or if we experience like a feast or famine, cycle or something like that growing up, all of that's going to be like front and center of like, oh no, this is happening again, things like that. So I like that you sort of hit on that a little bit too.
Well, we have another question from a long-time listener. He started the thing.
Who's that?
Yeah, the Reverend Fred Harrell, long-time listener to our program. Meet someone interesting. Great question. What is your advice to partnered people?
Saying like it's broken. I'm like, yes, we know.
All right. I think you're back up. I think we're back up.
Okay.
Are we back?
Hold on.
I see recent movement from me, so that's good.
Yeah, we're good. Everybody,
Okay.
We did it. We survived.
Did it. We're back. We survived.
We were in the middle of Fred's question.
Okay.
Riveting question.
So partners. So here's a practical way. I think some people like kind of come into a relationship with the groceries and I pay the rent and we do a little of that. And that can be hard to track what the real household spending is. And so at some point with trust and open conversation, I think it makes sense to have a house account and maybe a house credit card. And that's where the rent, the mortgage, the grocery bill, the car expenses, the kid stuff goes. And then if each person wants the freedom to go shopping or buy a bunch of, golf equipment or buy a motorcycle or whatever, you agree on, each of you has a slush fund that's sort of a personal checking account. And that might have $3,000 or $300, depending on your household, that person can spend and they don't need to talk about it. And usually that can address any sort of feelings around like control of spending. I think that's a good place to start. It doesn't always solve all the problems. I think there's a lot to be uncovered when we talk about money, as Stephen mentioned, like triggers that come from security or freedom, self-worth. It's tied into so much. So.
Great. We have another question. Can you hear me? Great.
Mm-hmm.
This comes from another longtime listener. We'll just keep rolling along. Any advice for small businesses, sole proprietors experiencing a big and unexpected slow season because of COVID and sheltering in place?
Yeah. Well, if you haven't already, the different stimulus packages, the payroll protection plan, as well as the emergency disaster loan. I forget, like EIDL or something. There's a symbol for it. Those loans have been really helpful for small business owners, and I expect that I know there's still some money in the payroll protection program. I don't know if Congress will approve any more stimulus, so I wouldn't count on that. There is interesting evolution of business when there's constraints. And so being creative and trying to figure out, what can I do more with less? How can I deliver what I was delivering before, but maybe with less expenses? What things can I cut back on? Or maybe there's other products and services I need to deliver that I wasn't before because I was so focused on one medium, which may have been a storefront or something. I've had to do that myself as a small business owner. To reconsider how I prefer to meet people in person. I can't do that right now. And also the type of advice people need is a little different. And so I've had to pivot and the demand has gone down. And so I've had to reduce some of my overhead so I don't have to carry that, not knowing when demand will pick up again.
It seems like for a lot of people, there's kind of an initial experience with this of there's the loss, but then there is, I like that you mentioned that I don't want to say that this is true everywhere, but in a lot of places there is some level of creativity and the constraints that we're presented with right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry, Jason.
No, it's great. We're figuring this out, everybody.
Yeah.
Next question is on housing in San Francisco. So the question is, any thoughts or tips for housing in San Francisco, buy versus rent?
Mm-hmm.
And a sub question to that is, how does having incredible rent control alter the answer of this question?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a very like personal, customizable answer. So it's hard for me to make a general. I would say my perspective on real estate is that you should only buy property, and this was before COVID, you should only buy property, whether it's here or in Spokane, Washington, if you plan to be in that home for 5 to 8 years. There's carry cost with real estate that's transactionally much higher than other investments. And I would say the juxtaposition, the other investment is like a stock fund, an index fund, a brokerage account, something like that. What else would you do with the money if you didn't have a down payment? So if you make that down payment, and you're going to live there, and you have the maintenance cost, the property tax, you have the fees of the bank loan when you move in, you have the commission when you go to sell the property. So when you think about all those costs, those are fine. You're going to live there and they cost something. If you aren't living there, you have to rent. So there is that comparison. But if you think for some reason that you might not be in San Francisco for 3 more years because your job might change, or you're just not sure about what's going to happen with distance learning in the schools, or all the factors that we have to weigh right now, then it might not be the right time to buy. Because if you need to get out of the property, not to say you would necessarily lose a lot of money, but there'd be a lot of transaction fees. But if you feel like I've been here for a long time, whether it's San Francisco or somewhere else, I'm ready to make this commitment, and I can still fund my retirement account. I can still reach other financial goals, whether that's saving for my kids' education, or going on a lovely vacation every year, or helping my parents. You need to make sure that you can meet all those things. And if it still pencils, then interest rates are great. I don't know that we'll see a huge dip in the selling price of properties in San Francisco, but there is less competition, at least in what I've heard from realtors in the last couple months. And that would be different in different markets because it's so localized. But if you have great rent control, then you have to think about, well, is this space still work for me if I'm here for the next 12 months working from home? And are there other things that I would prefer to spend my money on than a down payment and a mortgage? But for some people, like, having more space is going to make their family so much happier over the next 6 months, and that's definitely worth it.
Thanks for that. Jason, what else we got?
Yeah, I see one more. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, send your questions in the chat. We got one more right now. This is on children and money. So, question, what is your advice for parents in teaching children about money? Do you recommend allowances, savings accounts for kids?
I do. I've tried. Different kids take different interest in it. And it's all about their personalities. For myself, my dad sat me down on the eve before I started kindergarten, and he gave me an allowance of 25 cents a week. And he wrote down on a note card, 5 cents every week is for church, and 10 cents is for saving, and then 10 cents is for walking around money, is how he put it. I was like, what am I going to spend?
What do you do?
And then he said he would pay for my milk. I didn't have to save up my own money for milk in school. And that allowance continued until I was in high school. And it taught me to be very disciplined about money, and I really appreciated that. And so I've tried to do the same with my daughter. I think that understanding the cost of things is really important. While we don't expect kids to pay for every single thing or to always be able to earn their own money and pay for it, like understanding that it's you tend to value it more whether it's a new pair of shoes or a toy or something like that. In terms of savings accounts, I think that's really great. I think another smart thing is if they get to the point where they're making a little bit of money, whether it's for like babysitting or pet sitting or mowing the lawn, is to match their savings in the same way that employers match your 401k savings. So say like, okay, for every $5 you make babysitting, $1 goes in your savings account, and I'll put 50 cents in. And they're like, oh, that's cool. So if they can start to understand, well, then I have $1.50. Then that sort of incentivizes them to continue to save. And even if they don't have anything to save for yet, like my daughter's like, what am I going to spend it on? I want it now. It's at some point, where they want a car or they need something for college or something, they'll have a lot of money there saved. And so they'll have the reward of that. But there's a lot of I can email folks suggestions on good books to read on how to kind of start kids thinking about money. And of course, as parents, it's hard because there's times when you're going to buy them something and not, they my daughter never has her wallet with her. So then we have to but I want her the taking the money out of the wallet and paying for something is painful for her. So she needs to understand that versus mom used her credit card and then I owed her money later.
We have some kudos about walking around money. Apparently that's a thing. Southern thing. I think I've heard that too. I'm just going to be honest.
You're Southern too.
Yeah.
all the Southerners
I didn't have any walking around money. I'm going to be honest. But I know some people did. Yeah. I got another question here. Other end of life. So do you recommend life insurance?
I do, depending on the person's circumstances. And there's only one type of life insurance I recommend, which is term. So there are a lot of life insurance types of policies, and some of them confuse investments with life insurance. And I think those should be separate. So terms or words like variable, universal, whole are usually a hybrid of a life insurance and a investment product where there might be a value at the end of it. So even if you don't pass away, maybe you get a certain amount of money back. The trouble with those is there's a lot of fees, both in the front and over the time of the management. And I'm very hawkish about fees. So term life is when you have a contract with a life insurance company for, say, 20 years. And that's how long I expect to have children in the house and a mortgage. And so if something happens to me, my spouse is going to have to pay the mortgage and not have my income. And he's going to have to maybe hire childcare to help with the kids because he's not going to have me around, or he's going to have to take some time off work. And so having that policy, if I was to pass away, helps him meet all those needs. But once the mortgage is paid off and once the children are financially independent, it's not really necessary for him to any longer have life insurance on me. So those 20 years are up. We stop paying into it. There's no money back. The contract is null. And then if I die the next day, so be it, but there's no benefit. And so for folks that are either don't have dependents or they feel they don't maybe have any liabilities, for instance, a mortgage, then they might not need life insurance because there's sort of this assumption that there's no one counting on you for your income. But the rule of thumb is 10 times your annual earnings. So if you make $100,000 a year, then you should have $1 million worth of life insurance. And some people have a policy through their employer, but it might be for, say, just one-time salary. So it's $100,000. And that might not be sufficient for what your family would need if something happened to you. So then you go out and you buy a separate life insurance policy that kind of gets you up to the $1 million of coverage. It's cheaper when you're younger, so you want to buy it early. Like if you're having a baby, it's a good time to buy it versus waiting till you're in your 50s, just because you're healthier and you're cheaper to insure when you're younger. And the other thing I'll say is when you do have a life insurance policy that's with your employer, it's not what we call transportable. So you quit your job and go somewhere else, that policy terminates just the same way your health insurance does. So it's good to have a policy that's your own, that you pay and that you carry throughout the term.
It's a great question. Jason, do we have any more right now, or?
Yeah, I
got one or two.
I got one more.
Okay, cool.
Scrolling up. Do you recommend long-term care insurance?
That's a challenging one. It's very expensive now. What happened was long-term care was sold, policies were sold fairly inexpensively to baby boomers. And then those people either ended up living longer or costing more. And the insurance company started reneging on the contracts. And so now long-term care is very expensive to buy. Sometimes there's a combination of like a life and long-term care. But for folks under 50, I don't even think you should consider it. At the other end of that, nursing homes and home health care, full-time care is very expensive. Especially if it's something like memory care where you need 24 hours, it can be $15,000 a month. So depending on your resources, both like your retirement savings, your Social Security, pension, if you have that, other sources of income, then it might be worth it. But typically long-term care contracts are very complicated. They cover like up to a certain amount of months, but you have to have met all of these criteria. And so it's, when you look at the cost of it, it's hard to justify it. It could be like $5,000 a month, which you could say, I'm simply going to save that in a savings account and know that I've earmarked it for my healthcare when I get older and just kind of hold it there.
You have along those lines, and Jason, interrupt me if somebody's asking this question already, but for people on here who might be thinking ahead towards along the lines of long-term care, but potentially caring for aging parents in 10, 20, 30 years, do you have any advice for those folks?
Yeah, well, I mean, in sort of when I talk to clients, I have three main objectives that I address with them. So save, invest, and protect. And so savings is emergency fund, like we talked about at the beginning. Investments is like number one, retirement. And then what are the other goals? House, travel, whatever. And protection is, where are you exposed to financial risk? And so that's either through insurance, property insurance, life insurance, and it's through estate planning. Everyone at a bare minimum needs to have a will, an advanced healthcare directive, and a power of attorney. Even if you simply have like the clothes on your body and a cat, you have something, and you need to designate who should take care of those things if something happens to you. Mm-hmm. Getting these things done often spurs a conversation with your parents. What are their wishes, since they're closer, nearing the end of life, or they're steps ahead of us? And so it's good to have a transparent conversation and understand if they don't have those things, they need to get them in place. And depending on the state and some of the laws, it might make sense for them to have a living trust, which is sort of a fancier form of a will. You do need an attorney to write that for you, but it doesn't have to be ridiculously expensive to hire an attorney. And it makes settling an estate so much easier for the family as they're grieving your loss and just trying to sort things out, and also allows you to have a lot more control over how your assets are distributed, have a lot more say in it. So that's a conversation to have with parents, and it doesn't necessarily mean they need to reveal to you how much money they have, but that they have a plan. And then I think when it comes to questions around healthcare and affordability of that, understanding what their wishes are, if they want to stay in their home for as long as possible, if they have kind of thoughts, and a lot of parents do, as they get closer to life, they spend a lot of time thinking about that. It's hard to talk about. It really is. And for some families, a lot more than others, but it's important because I see more people go through it reactively, and it's a lot harder when like with anything, if we can talk about it when we're all cool and calm and collected and well rested, versus waiting for that day when like someone gets a scary diagnosis. But a home is sort of the resource of last resort. And so what we see is like a lot of boomers, if they don't have sufficient Social Security and retirement savings to cover their expenses, they say, well, I'll just sell the house. That's fine, but where are you going to live? And maybe it is time to sell the house and get into a smaller, rent a 1-bedroom apartment because you don't need a big house anymore. But let's do that before you are, too old to sort of make those decisions for yourself. But assuming that if the house is the largest asset that you have and your net worth, then you need to have a plan for how you're going to get money out of it. And a reverse mortgage is a terrible idea. So then you have to have like the family should be discussing, where do you want to live? How do you want to sell the house in that case?
We have a great question coming in from Elizabeth. She says, thank you, Sarah, for sharing with us. The question is, what do you think so the question's around generosity. What do you think radical yet financially sound generosity towards our neighbors looks like during this time?
So when you say our neighbors, if it's like you really want to impact people that are, what's hard about giving to charities is we don't always know exactly where it ends up, right? We can trust that the charity uses that money wisely, whatever organization we give to, but we don't necessarily see it. Whereas giving to neighbors or specific people that are in need can be really comforting. And I think then you have to be creative because there's a lot of, you have to be respectful of people's boundaries around receiving money. And I don't know if this is exactly what Elizabeth meant, but I think there's creative things like, gift cards to Target and Safeway, or simply tipping someone a lot more than they expected and just like walking away and letting them know that they got that much bigger tip than they would normally get. Those are discrete ways. Gas cards can be really helpful for some people. When you're thinking about your own budget, again, going back to that thought of like, how much can I give away in my plan kind of on an annual basis and still meet my needs and have a security blanket for my family, a rainy day fund. And again, like projecting those retirement goals or long-term financial goals. So it can feel sometimes like if I have a job and everyone around me right now does not have a job, I should just be giving my money away. But that's a very reactive thing. While it's generous and it's beautiful and kind, it's also very reactive. And so the plan is like, okay, every year I want to give away 10% of my income. This year I'm not getting a bonus, so that 10% might be a little bit less than it was last year, but that's what I'm committed to. But I might change how I allocate that. I might give more money to a cause that really speaks to me and less to something else over here, or depending on kind of what's happening in your life.
I think I don't see any other questions. Yeah.
That's great. Those are really good questions.
Yeah, really, really good questions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Sarah, as we start to wrap up, if people wanted to get in touch with you to talk further, how might they go about that?
Anybody can email me, and I'm always like an open book. I'm happy to answer quick questions on email. I think for a lot of folks, sometimes just having a gut check, like you're on the right track. There's good information online or in the media, but it can be so overwhelming to try to distill how like all the different financial decisions you're weighing at one point and make sense of it. I think we're kind of at like peak blog, peak podcast where there's so much free information. So having a live person to just be like, is this right? Like, should I buy this house or should I stay in this rent controlled apartment? Can you look at it for me? That can just like really set you on a course of confidence that can be really worthwhile. And I'm happy to do that for folks in the church community.
That's awesome. And Jason, are you sharing the contact info for Sarah?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool. Well, unless there's anything else, Jason or Sarah, I feel like we can wrap up. It's 7:55. Sarah, thank you so much for this. It was really interesting, and I'm sure really big blessing to the people watching live. And then there's also going to be others that will be watching once we put this up. Assuming we have your permission to put it up on our YouTube page for people to reference.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much, and thank all of you who are with us right now and for your questions. You'll want to be coming back here in 2 weeks. Jason and Fred will be hosting our Pride panel. June is LGBTQ Pride Month, and we're not going to be able to celebrate that as a church in the ways that we normally do, but we are finding some interesting ways to do that by hearing from some of the people in our LGBT CG. So come back for that in 2 weeks. But yeah, we'll look forward to seeing some of you then, and really looking forward to that real life reunion, which it's out there. Things aren't this isn't forever. Got to remember that. But I feel like we're making good use of it. So thank you.
All right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Good night. Bye.